Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to our Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to this session, Plenary Market Size, Trade and Development. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, Mr. Dani Rodrik, to open the session. Mr. Dani Rodrik, the screen is yours.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm delighted to chair this plenary and keynote session. It's a great pleasure to have Penny Goldberg with us. She does not need much introduction. Penny is professor of economics at Yale and also served as chief economist of the World Bank for a couple of years. With Penny, we share many things. Our roots in the Eastern Mediterranean at a personal level, but also many interests in questions of economics and economic policy, in particular the future of development strategy in developing countries in a very changing global and technological context. Penny has done some of the best work around on the intersection of international trade, industrial organization, economic development, and so I'm really looking forward very much to her presentation today. Those of you who are in the audience will have some time for questions and discussion. So as you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A box, which I will be monitoring. So with that, thank you very much, Penny, for being with us, and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Dani, for this kind introduction, and hello everyone, wherever you are. Let me start by sharing my screen. It will take a moment. Sorry. Okay, I hope you can see my screen now. Let me say it's a true pleasure to be speaking at this event, both because it's the World Congress, but also because this session is chaired by Dani. And what I'm going to talk about, the work that underlies this keynote address, was very much inspired by Dani's work. So all his writings over the last few decades, but also in particular a more recent book of his on structural transformation versus fundamentals. And as he mentioned earlier, the question that I want to talk about is what the new strategy, what the new vision for development is. While I was at the World Bank in the past 2 years, I perceived a general need for a new vision, and this need was evident not only at the World Bank, but more generally among many policymakers. So when we talk about development, there are, of course, many different theories about what drives development. I think a very good starting point is the taxonomy that Dani suggested in this recent book I mentioned, where he groups all existing theories in two main categories. They're the theories about structural transformation. And there the idea is that an economy has essentially two sectors, a low productivity sector and a high productivity sector. And development is the reallocation of resources from the low to the high productivity sector. And then there is a second set of theories that focus on fundamentals. By fundamentals, we mean human capital, infrastructure, institutions, and so on. And the idea there is that a country should invest in these fundamentals, Usually this takes long-term investments. But in the long run, this pan out, and if a country does things right, then eventually good things happen. Needless to say that I think of these explanations of these factors as being complementary rather than competing with each other. So my point of departure is going to be this taxonomy, but rather than thinking about those in terms of structural transformation versus fundamentals, I think it's also useful to think about them as demand side factors versus supply side factors. And I will explain in a moment what I mean. When we think about fundamentals like human capital, infrastructure, I tend to think of those as being more on the supply side, in the sense that if a country does the right thing, as I mentioned before, then eventually it may take a long time, but eventually things will happen. On the other hand, the structural transformation literature focuses more on the demand side. There's of course a huge literature that focuses on supply side constraints, from misallocation of capital to low investments in human capital and so on. There is a very nice chapter in the Handbook of Economic Growth by Banerjee and Duflo that review all existing theories. And I myself have made the point that investments in human capital and infrastructure are extremely important. However, what I'm going to focus in this talk, what the thesis of this talk is going to be, is that right now, the constraints on the demand side may become more binding. So specifically, I'm going to make the point that the small market size is becoming a binding constraint. So in some countries, especially in Africa, and so the old paradigm of structural transformation is under strain. In some sense, you can think of the point I'm making as being parallel to a point that Larry Summers has been making for the last few years in a very different context, in the context of advanced economies. So there, Larry has made the point that weak growth in aggregate demand contributes to secular stagnation. So his view emphasizes the role of the demand side. I'm going to do the same, but in a very different context. So what I'm going to talk about focuses on low-income countries, not on advanced countries, and the mechanism is going to be a very different one. What is the old structural transformation paradigm? Very briefly, the idea is that development is associated with a reallocation of resources from agriculture to industry to manufacturing and eventually to services. And services are also accompanied by urbanization. And in this process, openness and export-led industrialization play a very important role. So if you think about developing countries, if you think about low-income countries, these countries tend to be abundant in low-skill labor. So they have a natural comparative advantage in basic manufacturing. So the idea was that these countries can focus on where their comparative advantages on manufacturing, export these manufactured goods. This gives them access to the lucrative markets of high-income countries. This way they can exploit economies of scale, but at the same time, this process generates export revenue, and this revenue can be invested in these long-term factors I mentioned before. They can be invested to support infrastructure, human capital improvements, and so on. And in this paradigm, market size is not a constraint. The demand side is taken for granted. So for large countries, think of India or China, market size is not really a constraint. The domestic size is large enough to support development, to support economies of scale. This constraint, the market size constraint, may be more important for smaller countries, but as long as economies are open, this is not an issue. Of course, the reality is much more complex than these stylized models, and this is a point that many contributors to the structural transformation literature have made, including among others, Doug Golin, Paretta, and Rogerson, and so on. But I would argue that the experience in East Asia, so in particular China, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, roughly conforms to this paradigm. There are many qualifiers and many caveats and many additional conditions that for this process to unfold as I described it. But I would argue that as a first order, the growth, the development of these countries conforms with the structural transformation paradigm. What is different today, though? There are three points, three issues that make development today very different from that of the past decades. First, we are faced with increased automation, so the replacement of people, especially low-skilled labor, by robots. And this means that this traditional comparative advantage that developing countries have had in basic manufacturing can no longer be taken for granted. Second, we see worldwide, especially among advanced countries, a backlash against globalization and the emergence of economic nationalism. And this has important implications for developing countries in particular. And finally, empirically, we are faced with what Dani has labeled premature deindustrialization, especially in Africa. Again, so the transition of many economies from agriculture to services without having ever gone through industrialization. So this has led many, especially in international institutions, to the view that perhaps there is an alternative. Perhaps we can skip altogether this manufacturing stage and we can go directly from agriculture to services. So we can leapfrog in the 21st century. However, if you think about this, services are a highly heterogeneous category. So services include banking services, advanced services, digital services, and they also include very basic labor services. There is no particularly rigorous theoretical framework that explains how the emergence, how the growth of the service sector can lead to development. Along these lines, there is a very interesting paper by Golin, Jedwab, and Folrath that makes the point that in many countries in Africa, again, we witnessed what they call urbanization without industrialization. So this goes hand in hand with the growth of consumption versus production services. These consumption services may lead to growth, but they don't lead to sustained development. They don't have these nice properties that we associated with industrialization and growth of manufacturing. Along the same lines, there is another recent paper by three colleagues of mine, Fan, Peters, and Siliboti, that focuses on India and asks the question, the growth in India, we may argue how high this growth was exactly, but there is no question that India has grown very rapidly in the last 2 decades. So they asked the question, is growth in India, is it service-led or is it service-biased, in the sense that when an economy grows, then the service sector is going to grow as well. But were services in India really the engine of growth, or were they the consequence of growth? And the answer they give is quite nuanced. So to make a long story short, it's not clear services can play this role that many policymakers hope it could. So coming to the particular work I'm going to talk about today, let me start with the following observation. This is just one observation. So India, as I mentioned earlier, has been growing fast. But we will all agree that the growth has not been driven by manufacturing or exports. So that leads to a natural hypothesis that the large domestic market makes it much easier to develop when the economy is relatively closed. Of course, India is not closed, but it's not an export-oriented economy either. The reason is that there is the potential in a country like India to realize internal economies of scale. There is a counterexample to this story that immediately comes to mind. Take Nigeria. It's also a very large country, very rich in natural resources. And Nigeria has had periods of fast growth, but no sustained development and no sustained poverty reduction. And there are many countries in Africa that are very similar to Nigeria. And so that leads to an additional hypothesis, namely that development also requires a certain degree of equality, and I've put equality in quotes because I'll explain in a moment what I mean. So it needs a certain degree of equality so that if you have a positive shock, and this positive shock can be through an increase in agricultural productivity or exports or something else, this positive shock can trickle down to the population at large and generate additional demand, foster the growth of a middle class, and this way jumpstart a process of development. And so in this story, a certain degree of equality is prerequisite for development. So this story seems intuitive, and I would argue it describes to a large extent what's been happening in Africa for the last few decades. But it raises, for an economist, it raises several questions. I mentioned it's intuitive, but how exactly do we operationalize this idea? What does large market mean in this context? Along the same lines, what do we exactly mean by equality or development? How large does a market need to be for this mechanism to be relevant? And finally, what is a small country supposed to do if trade is not an option? And in order to answer these questions, one needs to develop a conceptual framework for thinking about it. Let me also mention before I get going that all these questions are most relevant in a world where trade is retreating, where we have a retreat from globalization. When the borders are open, when the world is entirely global, all these issues are less relevant because the relevant market for a country could be the world market. But a lot of this work was inspired by what's been happening in the world in the last few years, namely a retreat from globalization. You can read much more about the work underlying this address in a recent working paper that I put together out with Tristan Reed of the World Bank Income Distribution, International Integration and Sustained Poverty Reduction. And let me just briefly give you an overview of what this paper is about. There is a theoretical framework that's inspired by a paper by Murphy, Schleifer, and Vishny in 1989. This paper is not their famous paper on the big push, the one that was published in the JPE. It's a different paper that focuses more on the case of the closed economy. And that paper itself, it's a formalization of earlier ideas by many development economists, too many to even cite here, but most importantly, Arthur Lewis from the 1950s and 1960s. And this theoretical framework gives rise to an empirical threshold crossing models, similar to the models estimated in the industrial organization literature in the context of entry, and in particular, Bresnahan and Rees. And so what we do is we estimate this empirical model with panel data from multiple countries, and then we use it to answer some of the questions I posed before, among other things. How large does a market need to be? What's the role of international integration versus domestic size, and so on. So let me give you the main takeaways from this work, because I'm sure I won't have enough time to go to the details of this paper. The first one is, so this work did not start as work on trade. However, you come away with the insight that trade is essential, is absolutely crucial for the development of smaller economies. And to be more precise, what we find is that the threshold for development in a closed economy would be around 300 million people. So that means countries like India and China do not need the world market to develop, to reduce poverty. But outside India and China, there is hardly any country that could actually meet this threshold without being open. Now, you might argue there is nothing fundamentally surprising about that. I remind people that I'm Greek, and ancient Greeks or Phoenicians, they were traders. They have known this all along. But somehow we seem to have forgotten this these days. The second message is that if we don't have trade, or we don't have as much trade as we would like to, a certain degree of equality is absolutely crucial for growth. Why? Because it increases the effective market size of the domestic market. And so in that sense, growth and a certain degree of equality are complements in early stages of development. And finally, in the absence of global trade, if trade cannot be truly global, deep integration potentially under a regional umbrella could increase effective market size and aid development. So the roadmap for this talk is as follows. I will briefly present the theoretical framework, then explain how we go from the theory to the data that raises several conceptual issues. And then I will talk about the empirical implementation, what the empirical model is, and how we measure various variables, and then results and conclusions. And given that I don't have much time, there is no way I can go through these items in detail. I have a super set of slides that I'm not going to go through in detail. You can study them at your leisure if you want, or you can read the working paper, but I will simply try to give you a brief overview of the ideas. So the theoretical framework, as I mentioned, is based on the paper by Murphy and al. And the idea is that there is a small open economy. You can think of this economy as having three sectors: an agricultural sector, that's mainly food, manufacturing, and a cash crop, a cash crop or a mineral that's exported in return for food. So I put the word open in quotes because it's not truly an open economy. We don't have trade in manufacturing. You just have a very limited degree of trade. Namely, you have this cash crop that's not used for domestic consumption. It's just exported. Simplified, as simple as this model is, I think it captures the situation in many low-income countries. Again, many African countries come to mind, where they are rich in natural resources. They may have oil, they may have diamonds, they may have coffee. They export these minerals or this cash crop that generates export revenue, and they use it to a certain extent to import some goods. But these natural resources are not used for domestic consumption. Importantly, in manufacturing, there are two technologies. There is a traditional technology, a constant returns to scale technology, and then there is a new technology, the increasing returns to scale technology. And this is where the structural transformation literature element comes in that I mentioned before. So we have this duality. We have these two sectors, the increasing returns to scale sector and the constant returns to scale sector. And in the spirit, again, of structural transformation, development in this context means industrialization, means the transition from the constant returns to the increasing returns to scale sector. The adoption of this increasing returns to scale technology has a fixed cost, importantly. And what this means is that there has to be a minimum threshold market size for this technology to be adopted. This is the crucial idea in this framework. And so this threshold market size can be achieved in two main ways. You can use the domestic market, or you can use the international market. And again, in this framework, if you focus on the domestic market, then the middle class plays a very important role. What is middle class here? Again, the nice thing about the theoretical framework is it allows one to be more precise about these terms that we can use very casually in everyday conversation. Middle class in this model refers to the consumers who are above a subsistence level, but they're below the level at which luxury goods are consumed. So the consumption patterns in this economy are as follows. Consumers, poor consumers below the subsistence level, use their income to buy just food. Then there is the middle class. The middle class are the people between the subsistence level and between the level that can sustain the consumption of luxury goods. And these people buy industrialized goods that can be produced with this increasing returns to scale technology. And then there is an upper class. And this upper class uses their income, their resources to first buy food, then they buy industrialized goods that are mass produced, and then they also buy the luxury goods that are produced with the traditional technology. Let me also point out that the role of the middle class has been emphasized in the development literature many times before in many previous papers. And again, there's a very nice paper by Banerjee and Duflo that provides an overview of the various theories that can be classified into three groups. They're the theories that emphasize the importance of middle class for entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is considered to be important for development, and many entrepreneurs come out of the middle class. Then there are the theories that emphasize that middle class may have values that support development. For example, they may save more or support education. So these are the supply side factors I mentioned earlier. And then there is a third set of theories that emphasize the purchasing power of the middle class. So in this framework that I'm presenting now, the emphasis is on this third factor. The middle class is important because of its purchasing power. And the reason it's so important in this framework is because they generate profits for the firm that introduces this increasing returns to scale technology. Not only do they generate profits, but they also generate spillovers and multiplier effects. So all the profits that come back to the middle class go back to the industrialized sector, they go back to the manufacturing sector as additional demand. And so that sets off a virtual cycle of development. So that's the main idea of the theoretical framework. And I'm sorry, I don't have the time to go into more details, but let me briefly summarize its implications for development here. So one can ask the question, when will in this framework development in the sense of industrialization fail? And you can think of the following two cases. So the first is that the economy is too poor. So the rents or the profits are too low to support the development of these increasing returns to scale technology. In this case, what the economy needs is a wealth boost. And the wealth boost can come either from agriculture, from an increase in agricultural productivity, or it can come through an increase in exports. For example, an increase in exports of oil or cash crops. And of course, the literature has emphasized this factor. So if you think about the work of Lewis again, or the emphasis on agricultural productivity, it's precisely for this reason. I will argue that this is not a constraint for most developing countries today. So again, if we think about Africa, where poverty is concentrated these days, most African countries are truly rich in natural resources. And even though they have not experienced the increase in agricultural productivity that India, for example, has experienced, they have had commodity price booms repeatedly. It's just that these commodity price booms have not translated to development. And so that brings me to the second factor. Why can industrialization fail? And that's when the economies are too unequal. And so, for example, when all the wealth is held in the hands of very few, there could be simply very few people who can support demand for industrialized goods, for manufactured goods. Or alternatively, it could be that the middle class is too small. And so even though this technology is adopted, there are no spillover effects, there are no multiplier effects, and development never takes off. So in short, the implications for development here are as follows: that if you're a poor country, if you're a low-income country, you need the following conditions for development. You need an initial boost, so a wealth effect that can be achieved either through agricultural productivity or through exports of cash crop. You need, in the absence of trade, you would need a large enough market to support the adoption of increasing returns to scale technology. And without trade, this market has to be domestic. And finally, you need a certain degree of equality in the sense of having a sufficiently large middle class. And let me also point out that the emphasis here is entirely on the demand side. This is, again, not because I want to downplay the supply side factors. I think they are first order, but I think they have already been emphasized in a lot of work. Let me also say a few words about the role of trade in this model, which I think is quite interesting. The role of trade in this model is threefold. So first, trade can support this initial wealth boost through exports. And so that hinges on the traditional forces of comparative advantage that have been emphasized in the literature. Second, I was not explicit about that, but trade can also allow a country to lower the fixed costs of adopting this new technology by allowing for imports, for cheaper imports of capital goods or intermediate products. And this is, a point that I have emphasized in other work on India, for example, together with various co-authors, where we show that perhaps one of the most beneficial effects of this Indian trade liberalization of the 90s was it lowered the price of intermediates of capital goods. But in this framework, the number one role of trade, the reason trade would be important is because it increases the market size in the open economy. And it allows countries, especially small countries, to adopt the IRS technology. And in that sense, I think the role that trade plays here is a little different from the role of trade emphasized by Hellman and Krugman, for example, in their work on increasing returns to scale. So there the emphasis is on what the patterns of trade are and what the gains from trade are in the presence of increasing returns to scale. Here in this model, trade is what allows countries, or what may allow countries, to adopt IRS in the first place. So in that sense, even though this framework is entirely static, there are no dynamics in this framework, I do think that this framework hinges on some dynamic gains from trade, namely the potential for an economy to adopt, through an open economy, through trade, to adopt new technologies. So I think that also may explain why why empirically we often observe that open economies develop very fast, grow very fast. This is something that's often very hard to reconcile with traditional models of comparative advantage, where the gains from trade tend to be more nuanced, tend to be more subdued, compared to the gains that many of us assume openness has. Okay, now that's roughly the theoretical framework, and let me say a few words about how we get from the theory to the data. This is a highly stylized model, and what does it mean to take it to the data? We will not attempt to test the model in the formal sense, because we know that the model is false. As Krugman pointed out in a very interesting piece he wrote, The Fall and Rise of Development. If I had more time, I would summarize his paper, but he makes exactly this point. So what we are doing is very much in the spirit of Limmer, who in '95, in his chapter for the Handbook of International Economics, coined this famous among international economists phrase, estimate, do not test. So what we do in the empirical framework is we focus on the main ideas of the theory. We estimate an empirical model that's inspired by the theoretical framework. And when I say inspired, I mean that the model suggests which variables we're going to include and how they enter the model. And then we estimate these parameters, and we ask the question, do they look sensible, and how does overall the model do relative to a kitchen sink approach? And then once we have the model estimated, we ask the questions, what is the role of domestic versus international market size for development? And we can also do counterfactuals. So among other things, we can ask the question, we can try to answer the question I posed at the beginning, namely, how large does a market need to be in order not to rely on trade? Let me now come to some conceptual or measurement issues. And again, I will be very fast here. We could debate those issues forever, and I hope there will be enough time at the end to talk more about those. We define development as sustained poverty reduction for this paper. We don't attempt to measure it in terms of increasing returns to scale, because the measurement of increasing returns to scale has been elusive in empirical work anyway. The word sustained is very important here. We want to exclude temporary episodes of apparent poverty reduction that are caused by a commodity price boom, for example. And so the empirical framework is, as I mentioned earlier, inspired by the industrial organization literature. So in some sense, it combines the Murphy and Toll paper with Bresnahan and Rees. And the idea is the following. So in our framework, development means adoption of the increasing returns to scale technology, right? And the adoption of this technology leads to a natural break-even condition. This condition is that the variable profits have to be at least as high as the fixed costs. So this is very similar to the break-even condition in entry models. In entry models, the question is, how large does a market need to be to support one firm, two firms, three firms, and so on? Here we ask the question, how large does a market need to be to support development, to support sustained poverty reduction? And the advantage of thinking about this issue this way is we don't need to have data on firms' prices and quantities, which are impossible to get at the scale we need them. Instead, we can rely on market level data and market level observables. So I'm not going to put up many equations, but this is something I think I feel I need to show. This is the first equation you see here is the expression for the profits in the increasing returns to scale sector, and this is almost definitional. What this says is that the profits are equal to the market size S times the variable profits per capita, okay, minus the fixed cost of adoption. So this is definitional, plus an error term that captures all factors left outside the model and measurement error. And under the assumption that this error term is normally distributed, this leads to a probit equation that we can estimate. The market size is denoted here by M. And as you can see, the variable profits and the fixed costs are specified as functions of demand shifters and cost shifters. The Greek letters denote parameters that we estimate. So this is general. This, as I pointed out before, except for the assumption on the error term, it's definitional. Where the theory comes in is in how exactly we specify these functions. And there we are guided closely by the model I outlined before. We model market size as a function of three main variables. First, raw population. So that's here the population below middle class. So how large is the population of a country? Second, the middle class share of this country. And then finally, the size of the integrated market, the internationally integrated market. And the size of the integrated market can be measured in two ways. You can measure it in terms of population, or you can measure it in terms of income. So in other words, when a country connects with other countries all over the world, we can measure this global market in terms of the total number of consumers that this country has access to, or we can also measure it in terms of purchasing power, in terms of the per capita income that these consumers have. The per capita variable profits are specified as a function of past export growth and also as a function of past agricultural productivity growth. And again, here we follow very closely the spirit of the model that suggests that these are the factors that generate this initial wealth boost. And then the fixed costs of adoption are specified as a function of many observable geographical and institutional factors. So all these factors have been shown to be very important for development, and we do control for those in the empirics. But again, we are the way they enter the model is the empirical model is guided very much by the theoretical model, namely they enter as part of the fixed costs. So this is the framework, and that allows us to back out the threshold market size, which is given by this expression, right? So this tells us how large a market needs to be, and under various scenarios, under various counterfactuals. Measurement, how do we measure all these variables? Again, very briefly here, we have data from 1980 to 2015, and we use the World Bank's POVCalNet to get estimates of poverty for all countries that still have poverty rates above 3%. So we exclude the high income countries because for those countries, poverty is no longer an issue. So what we do is we take this period, 1980 to 2015, we break it into 5-year intervals. And for each of these 5-year intervals, we ask the question, do we observe poverty going down in every single year in this interval? So do we see poverty continuously decline over this time? If the answer is yes, then we say poverty did go down. So we assign a dummy equal to 1 to poverty reduction, to extreme poverty reduction. If poverty goes down in some years but comes up again, then we say that there was no sustained poverty reduction over this time. And again, we can debate the particular way this is done. There are many judgment calls when you measure variables like this one, but ultimately perhaps the most convincing answer to any concerns one may have is extensive robustness analysis. Let me show you what the patterns look like, because that serves also as a sanity check, as a smell check that this measurement is consistent with common wisdom. This is what poverty reduction, according to our estimates, looks like in Asia. So you see for many countries, for most countries, a continuous decline in poverty over the last few decades. This is what the patterns look in Africa, and you can immediately see that Africa looks very different from Asia. In many countries, we have periods of rapid poverty reduction. The blue line here is Ethiopia, but look at Nigeria, for example. We do have periods of poverty reduction, but then there is stagnation. If you look at a country like Cote d'Ivoire, poverty is actually going up in many years. One could write a paper just on studying these poverty reduction patterns that are very interesting. Let me make one point that I think is very important for thinking about these issues. The point is that sustained poverty reduction is highly correlated with sustained growth, but they're not the same thing. So poverty reduction is not synonymous with growth. So if you look at this table, focus first on the yellow, on the number highlighted in yellow. So this number tells you, gives the number of instances in which we observe both poverty reduction and growth, always sustained in the sustained sense. And if you focus on cases where poverty reduction was reduced, then in 76% of these cases, there was also sustained growth. So growth and poverty reduction are highly correlated, and this is why economists have repeatedly emphasized that perhaps the best way to reduce poverty is to foster growth. So that's certainly true. However, growth by itself doesn't necessarily lead to poverty reduction. So if you also look at the cases where we had no poverty reduction, these are the rows of zeros here, in 50% of these cases, we had growth. We had growth, but no poverty reduction. So growth doesn't automatically lead to sustained poverty reduction. I'll skip this slide. Let me come to the measurement of market size. We measure market size in terms of international trade agreements. So what we do is we take a country, we consider all the trade treaties that this country has signed with other countries. The trade treaties we consider are as follows. There is the GATT, there is the WTO, the Agreement on Government Procurement, and preferential trade agreements. Okay, and there's a total of 32 provisions that countries can sign. We develop weights, so how many provisions has a country signed relative to the total of 32 that's possible. And then what we do is we take all these countries that the country has signed agreements with, and we sum up their populations, or alternative, we sum up their relative incomes, their per capita incomes. And these are not unweighted sums. We weigh the sum by the number of provisions each country has signed. So I realize I went through this quite fast, and you can read the slides for details, but the idea is we develop a measure of the integrated market that each country has, that is a weighted average, a weighted sum actually of the populations and the incomes of the trade partners, and the weights are given by the fraction of provisions that these countries have signed. There are various advantages of this approach. One is that it's based on trade agreements which are actionable from a point of view of the government. They're not based on outcomes such as trade flows. It allows us to distinguish between the role of raw population versus income. And in case I run out of time, let me say this is going to come out in the results very strongly, that the relative income of your trade partners is more important than the population. And finally, one other aspect that's very interesting is that this measure depends on both the integration efforts of your country and the integration in the rest of the world. And one thing that comes out very clearly in the graphs, in the descriptives, is the role of China. So let me show you some graphs that tell the full story. I think these are very interesting. So this is the size of the integrated market for WTO member states over time. And as I mentioned, you can measure the size of the integrated market by population. This is the red line, or by income per capita, and this is the blue line. So if you focus on the red line, see what happens in 2001. 2001 is the year when China enters the WTO, and then population, the global integrated market in terms of population, jumps up, right, given the population of China. Look at what happens with income per capita. Income per capita goes down the same year, and that's because at that time, China was substantially poorer than the rest of the world, right? You can do that for different regions of the world. And again, I think that these graphs are very interesting because they capture something that we have known and has been in the media for a long time, namely the role of China, the role that global integration has played in the last few years. So one line that's very interesting is the purple one here. This is Sub-Saharan Africa. And again, you can see the role of China here, what happens. One important takeaway from these graphs is that if you focus on countries in Africa, these countries have started integrating. They were connecting to the global markets. They were connecting to more lucrative markets. Then when China enters, then all of a sudden they're exposed to a larger market in terms of population, but then one of the main trade partners is actually a competitor, is a country that at that time at least had a very low per capita income. So they're exposed to a competitor rather than a potentially lucrative export market. So there is integration, but there is a very different kind of integration around that time. And finally, in terms of the domestic market size, we measure the size of the global middle class. And these are the people who have per capita income per day between $11 and $100 measured in PPP in 2011 US dollars. And again, I could expand on why exactly we measure it this way. One point I want to make, though, that's quite interesting. Again, these are graphs that show how the middle class looks like as percent of natural population over the years. And you can see that our very low incomes, the size of the middle class is very low and also very highly correlated with per capita GDP. But once you come here in that range, so this range spans incomes between $3,000 and $22,000 per capita per year. And here you see very high dispersion across countries in the size of the middle class. Another very interesting pattern in the data is if you look over the years, the size of the middle class, of the global middle class, is declining. That, I think, is again something very interesting, and it relates to the literature on polarization. But at any rate, I want to show you these patterns because I think they are captivating. Now let me come to the results, and I'll try to wrap up as fast as I can. There are three variables. First, in terms of the general fit of the model, in general, the model does quite well. So a measure of fit we develop is 0.735. This is much better than a random guess of 0.5. We do find that these institutional and geographical factors that people have emphasized are very important. But again, these all enter through the fixed cost in the model. We find that these three variables that I mentioned, middle class and international market size, are very important for sustained poverty reduction. And to give you a sense of what the numbers mean, let me say the following, that what we find that if you increase the share of population in the global middle class by 10%, this is equivalent to adding 54 million people to the population. So it's a very large effect. In terms of the international market size, the integrated market is very important. However, the relative income per capita is much more important than the population of the countries you integrated with. So in short, it's much more important to integrate with richer countries. To give you again an example of what the numbers mean, take as an example the country of Afghanistan that has a population of 35 million. Suppose Afghanistan integrates with Iran. Iran has 2.3 times the population of Afghanistan. So according to our estimates, this would be equivalent to adding 360,000 people. If it integrates with Pakistan, Pakistan is a much larger country, 5.7 times the size of Afghanistan. That would be equivalent to adding 912,000 people in the population. So from a point of view of population, Pakistan is more valuable than Iran to Afghanistan. But now look at relative income. So Iran has 10 times the per capita income of Afghanistan. So integrating with Iran is equivalent to adding 200 million people in the population of Afghanistan. Integrating with Pakistan is equivalent to adding 60 million people to the population of Afghanistan. So in short, integration with richer countries is very important. And that's one reason that one may be pessimistic about the future for many developing countries, because it seems to me that the trade with advanced economies is closing. There is much more willingness in advanced economies, for good reasons perhaps, to open up to low-income countries. We estimate the threshold market size to be 328 million people. So think of this as being raw bodies, so people below the middle class. And in this framework, this number can be achieved, as I mentioned earlier, in three ways. It can be achieved through raw population, but then there are only two countries that meet this criterion, India and China. It can be achieved by increasing the middle class. That calls for drastic domestic redistribution of resources. And finally, it can be achieved through international integration. So international trade is very important in this framework, but it's mainly through a market size channel. And the income distribution turns out to be also incredibly important, but through the channel of middle class. So let me conclude with these graphs just to give you, again, an idea of what it means for the world, what these numbers mean for the world. If you take the current level of integration and you group countries according to the per capita income in deciles, then you can ask the question, how many countries would be able to achieve sustained poverty reduction if they were closed? That corresponds to the red bar here. And how many countries would be able to achieve that if they were integrated at the current level of integration? These are the blue bars. And one thing that you can see from this graph is it's not until the sixth decile where countries are large enough, based on their raw population or their domestic middle class, to achieve poverty reduction without being open. To give some specific country examples, China is a very large country. It can sustain poverty reduction. It can achieve sustained poverty reduction even if it were closed. That's the red bar. Of course, it does better when it's integrated. It happens faster, but it would have happened with the right policies, and that's where the supply side comes in. It would have happened with the right policies, even if it were closed. If you come here to the African countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, for these countries, it's impossible to achieve poverty reduction when they are closed. It's even hard to do that at current levels of international integration. So to conclude, for a small country, it's nearly impossible to eliminate poverty if it's closed. The size of the domestic market can compensate for lack of trade, but our estimates suggest that this domestic market needs to be extremely large, above 300 million, for these domestic increasing returns to kick in. Then what is a small country supposed to do? So deep integration can potentially substitute for the small domestic market, but let me point out that we have never experienced this, not even for the European Union. And Dani has written a lot about this, why this is so hard to achieve. Alternatively, a certain degree of equality in the sense of supporting a large middle class can compensate for the small market. And that means that in the current policy environment where we are seeing many advanced countries, many potentially lucrative export markets closing up and turning inward, a certain degree of equality is more important than ever and may act as a complement and not substitute for growth. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Penny. That was really fascinating. You have really presented several studies, and I think both the theory and the empirical results are very interesting, combining and integrating questions about development strategy, about income inequality in a particular sense, emphasizing the importance of the middle class and the role of the global trade regime and openness and so forth. I have a lot of questions. We have only 6 minutes left before the next session. but this has really been fascinating, a lot of food for thought. There are a number of questions also on the chat box. Maybe I'll piggyback on one of the questions in the chat box, I believe from Omar Licandro, who sort of questions, and I'll put my own spin on this because it's related to a question I wanted to ask. Sort of how important are these? Sort of your view is really that there is this a threshold effect, and which gives you this kind of threshold level of population. So if we take that seriously, essentially all that you need to do is cross that threshold. And there are countries, for either because they're large or because they're open and integrated, they're below the threshold, above the threshold, and those that are below the threshold. But it's really the key thing is crossing that threshold. And development looks very different for countries below the threshold, should look very different from above the threshold. But if you separate those two countries, into those two groups, then, income inequality, distribution, the size of the middle class, how integrated they are, really doesn't matter a whole lot once you are in one or the other. So the whole thing is whether you're on so, first, I mean, is there any evidence in the data that there is that kind of discontinuity, or that there are these two different clubs of countries in terms of their behavior? Or is it not more that we have sort of a more continuous relationship? And I think the way that Omar put it, I think in the comments, was that we normally think that it's critical for countries to have access to international trade, international technology, and that sustains development irrespective of a country's size. So there is not such a sort of a kind of a threshold effect.
Yes, thank you, Dani. I mean, this is a very interesting question. So first, let me say, I don't view that as this work as sending the message that this is the only thing that matters, that the threshold is the only thing that the country needs to achieve. I just think, as I said at the beginning, I think this is becoming a binding constraint. I do think there is evidence that we have these two groups of countries. There are countries that over the years have not managed to reduce poverty. So there are countries, this dichotomy that you mentioned about is reflected in the fact that we still have low-income countries, countries with very high poverty rates, and countries that have managed to reduce poverty. So I think, as a rough approximation, yes, I do believe that there is this dichotomy in the data. I would not say that this is the only factor that the country needs to do. I just think it's important, especially at the very early stage of development, to think about the role of market size, because we emphasize in many of the policy prescriptions these days, we emphasize the importance of being, as was mentioned, open to trade because of the knowledge transfer trade allows. We emphasize the importance of human capital, the importance of education, the importance of improving institutions. But ultimately, you need also to be clear about where these people are going to be employed. What is going to generate demand? What is going to generate employment? How will these people be absorbed in the economy? And I think this is where the bottleneck is these days, and this is where the current development strategy falls short. So I think, as I said in the very first slide, that the two theories are complementary. You do need all these factors to be in place, but you also need to have crossed this threshold in terms of market size. Otherwise, no matter what investments you have on other fronts, cannot lead to sustained development.
So I think the idea that this has become more of a binding constraint is I think, a very interesting one. I'd love to have a chance to continue this discussion with you, but I'm also very mindful of the time and the fact that we don't want to encroach on the time of subsequent sessions. So unfortunately, we have to cut it off here. Please join me again in thanking Penny Goldberg for a very, very interesting presentation and for being with us. Thank you, Penny.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining. I see all the questions in the chat room. I'm very sorry I cannot answer them all, but I think, as Dani mentioned, I don't view that as the ultimate answers. I view it as food of thought. I think we should be thinking about these issues going forward, and I'm very much looking forward to engaging in more discussion about these issues in the future. Thank you, Dani.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.